The story of forgiveness, or the absence of it, within the royal family didn't begin with Oprah's headline-making interview. Its roots stretched back years earlier, hidden in quiet hallways and hushed conversations, where the monarchy's path was quietly being reshaped by a single relationship. When Prince Harry introduced Meghan Markle to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen sensed something she hadn't encountered in decades. It wasn't just charm or ambition, but a steely determination wrapped in Hollywood sophistication, and it unsettled her. For the Queen, tradition had always been her anchor. Yet here was a woman who appeared ready to bend those traditions to her own will. Eager to show goodwill, the Queen broke precedent almost immediately. Meghan was invited to Sandringham for Christmas, a privilege no unmarried partner had ever been granted. Even Doria Ragland and Thomas Markle were floated as potential guests, an extraordinary gesture of inclusion. But gratitude never followed. Instead, the palace watched as Meghan seemed to tighten her control. She rejected her father's involvement, kept her own family at arm's length, and insisted on entering royal life as a figure entirely unattached. To the Queen, it felt less like chance and more like calculation. The message was unmistakable. Meghan wanted no past to examine, no family ties to weigh her down, only the image of a misunderstood outsider stepping boldly into the royal sphere. That narrative became the foundation of the wedding itself. Behind the radiant smiles and dazzling pageantry, insiders whispered that the event had stopped being about Harry and Meghan long before the vows. It had become a performance. The guest list brimmed with Hollywood names who shared little or no personal connection with the couple, while family members were deliberately sidelined. Meghan's father, recovering from health struggles, was excluded altogether. Her half-siblings were ignored. Even her mother, though present, was kept on the margins. Cameras captured Doria sitting alone in her green coat, separated from the Windsor line, a perfectly framed image that underscored Meghan's story of being isolated, unwanted, and unprotected. Prince Charles, always mindful of appearances, tried to soften the optics. He paid for Doria's wardrobe, brought in an American pastor, and arranged a gospel choir to showcase Meghan's heritage. On the surface, it looked like celebration. Beneath it, it was damage control. The royal family found themselves bending over backwards, not out of happiness, but out of fear. Fear that even the slightest misstep might spark accusations of racism the monarchy was desperate to avoid. The Queen had believed that gestures of kindness would ease suspicion. Instead, the opposite happened. Every concession only seemed to strengthen Meghan's hand. The spending alone told its own story. £30 million were funneled into the wedding, with security costs reaching unprecedented levels. Even Princess Diana's wedding hadn't required protection on that scale. In comparison, Princess Eugenie's ceremony later that same year seemed modest, almost restrained. Inside palace walls, resentment festered. Why was such a staggering sum being poured into a union that felt less like a marriage and more like a production? Why were centuries of protocol abandoned for someone who appeared determined to rewrite the royal playbook in her own image? But perhaps the most unsettling realization came with timing. Every step in Harry and Meghan's narrative seemed crafted to eclipse another royal milestone. When Princess Eugenie announced her engagement, Meghan's pregnancy revelation quickly stole the spotlight. When other royals stepped into public view, Meghan and Harry rolled out new photos, staged appearances, or headline-grabbing stories. This wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate strategy, not chance. An institution built on tradition and hierarchy suddenly found itself at the mercy of someone who wielded the modern media with more precision than any crown jewel ever could. By the morning of the wedding, the Queen's smile was thin, her eyes heavy. She knew she was overseeing more than vows. She was watching the beginning of a shift that could change the monarchy forever. Charles looked uneasy. William kept his distance, and Harry, blinded by devotion, refused to hear a single warning. For the Queen, it wasn't simply disapproval, it was surrender. She hadn't given her blessing freely. She had been boxed into compliance, and Charles, watching quietly from the sidelines, would never forget it. To him, the day his mother bowed to pressure wasn't a triumph, it was a humiliation, one that he would carry with him long after the crown rested on his own head. As the applause from the wedding faded, the cracks beneath the glittering facade began to show. Inside Buckingham Palace, hushed whispers turned into midnight meetings. Senior courtiers compared notes, piecing together how every decision had been forced, rushed, or carefully manipulated. Prince Charles was especially troubled. He had gone out of his way to extend generosity to Meghan, offering financial support for her mother, suggesting flying her father to London after his health scare, promising personal assistance, yet each offer had been refused, not quietly but pointedly, with a defiance that made it clear she wasn't seeking integration. She was choosing separation, and Harry, ever protective, became the shield that allowed it to happen. The early months of marriage should have been filled with ease and celebration. Instead, they resembled a political campaign. Leaks began appearing in the press, not from prying tabloids, but from staff who felt trapped. Aides spoke of icy silences, sudden tempers, and demands for deference. Meghan wasn't merely adjusting to royal life, she was reshaping it to suit her own terms. Photographs were tightly managed. Narratives of mistreatment were quietly planted. By the time she sat down with Oprah, the story was already in place. The role of the mistreated outsider had been crafted long before the cameras ever began rolling. And then came the pregnancy, a storyline that only deepened the palace's unease. When Meghan announced she was expecting, royal protocol dictated layers of tradition, medical oversight, official records, and announcements delivered through trusted channels. Yet the details never aligned. Hospital stays that should have lasted hours were reduced to minutes. Records were withheld. Questions lingered without answers. Seasoned staff who had spent decades documenting royal birth felt excluded and sidelined. To the outside world, it appeared as a joyful milestone. To the palace, it felt like theater, a carefully timed performance that always seemed to surface whenever scrutiny grew too sharp. Inside the family, tensions mounted. Prince William and Charles disagreed over how to respond. William pushed for firmness. Boundaries had to be drawn before the monarchy's credibility unraveled. Charles, weighed down by past regrets and desperate not to lose Harry, leaned toward diplomacy. He urged his son to reach out to Thomas Markle, to show public compassion, to slow down the storm. But Harry refused. His loyalty to Meghan was absolute, his distance from William deepening with every confrontation. The once close bond between the brothers grew icy, and behind the practiced smiles at official engagements, the tension was visible enough for even outsiders to notice. The Queen, long accustomed to navigating crises, chose silence. But that silence was heavy. Insiders described her as observant, her disappointment plain, though never spoken aloud. She had given her blessing in the hope of protecting the monarchy's image. And yet now, that same monarchy was being painted as cold, cruel, and racist. The very accusations she had tried to soften with kindness. For Charles, it was torment. He hadn't only supported the marriage, he had personally stepped in to walk Meghan down the aisle when her father was absent. What he had intended as an act of compassion was now being recast as complicity in what he increasingly viewed as a trap. Media strategy became the couple's sharpest weapon. Every royal engagement risked being overshadowed by a sudden announcement, a strategically placed interview, or a dramatic revelation. Staff, half in jest and half in frustration, remarked that Meghan had mastered the art of hijacking headlines. What had once been a centuries-old institution anchored in duty was now caught in a relentless battle for narrative control against one of its own. And through it all, Charles's patience thinned. He had watched his mother cornered into saying yes. He himself had been pushed into the role of peacemaker. And Harry, once his pride, now felt unreachable. His devotion to his wife eclipsing the bond with the family that had raised him. The monarchy had endured divorces, scandals, even abdications. But this was different. It wasn't mere family drama. It was deliberate. It was spectacle. And it came at the monarchy's expense. Behind closed doors, Charles began to glimpse the shape of his own reign. A crown burdened by the shadow of one decision his mother had been forced to make, and a bitterness he knew he could never shake. The reign of King Charles carries more than the weight of tradition. It carries a wound that never closed. In public, he presents the image of a monarch, stoic, measured, restrained. But within the palace walls, resentment lingers like an old scar. He remembers watching his mother, a woman who had ruled with unshakable patience, backed into a corner where tradition yielded to accusation. That moment defined him as surely as any coronation vow. Forgiveness, once possible, hardened into permanence. To Charles, Meghan Markle was never just a daughter-in-law. She became the emblem of a humiliation the monarchy could never erase. The whispers of staff grew into warnings from insiders, each recounting how Meghan and Harry had reshaped the royal image entirely on their own terms. The Queen's gestures of kindness, inviting Meghan to Sandringham, granting privileges no outsider had received before, were later twisted into a narrative of exclusion and cruelty. The millions poured into the wedding, the very public shows of inclusion, the compromises made at every stage, all recast as proof of a monarchy unwilling to embrace difference. For Charles, it was infuriating. He had personally extended generosity to shield Meghan's dignity, only to be recast as part of an institution accused of conspiring against her. As the years passed, the damage set like stone. Harry's bond with his brother fractured beyond repair, every attempt at reconciliation collapsing under layers of mistrust and wounded pride. William grew resolute, choosing duty over sentiment. Charles, in contrast, turned inward. He quietly set about building safeguards. Lawyers drafting reforms to prevent future exploitation of titles and succession. Courtiers ordered to tighten control over family records and ceremonies. What had once been a monarchy proud of its tradition became one consumed by defense, determined never again to be blindsided by a rogue narrative. Across the Atlantic, Meghan refined her brand. Glossy interviews, media ventures, and carefully polished appearances built a new identity, one thriving entirely outside the need for royal approval. For her, the monarchy was no longer a stage to conquer, but a chapter to cite, a story of survival and defiance that the public devoured eagerly. For Charles, however, each new headline was a painful reminder, not just of Meghan, but of Harry's distance, of a family pulled apart, and of his mother's authority bent under outside pressure. The Queen's passing shifted the spotlight, but did nothing to mend the rift. At her funeral, photographs of Harry standing apart from William told the story more clearly than any tabloid could. What divided them wasn't grief, it was years of mistrust, rooted in a single choice, an approval granted under duress. Charles ascended the throne carrying the weight of history, yet his triumph felt muted. He had inherited not just a crown, but a reminder that even the monarchy could be manipulated when fear outweighed resolve. Behind palace walls, aides sometimes call it the shotgun wedding, not for scandal or romance, but because it was forced through by circumstances no one dared challenge. To many, it remains the final great miscalculation of Elizabeth's reign. To Charles, it is something far deeper. It is the reason forgiveness is impossible.